What happens when your worst fear becomes your reality? Hi, I'm Brent Cassidy. Welcome to the Nightmare Success In and Out podcast, where we explore how to overcome your fears and nightmares and set yourself free. We're going to be exploring this topic with guys I was in Leavenworth with and others who survived their own nightmare. These stories can be inspiring, sometimes sad. There's some humor, but hopefully you can come away with a nugget of something that'll help you knock down some of the prisons you built up in your own mind. Welcome back, Nightmare Success listeners. You guys come here for the good stuff with what happens when your worst fear becomes your reality. How do you adapt, survive, overcome, set yourself free? Well, man, do I have something. I'm thrilled to be doing this interview. I was telling Sam Patten's my guest today, and I was telling my political science degree is on hyper overdrive today. As all of you know, because you have all been in this world since 2016, you had the Robert Mueller investigation, the special Russiagate. You had all that going on, and one of these, there's a few of them, but Sam Patten was one of the guys that got wrapped up in a charge that he had to eat, really, which was part of this investigation. But his resume is fascinating. He's got a new book that's coming out. I just want to read just a piece of this, just because I was just looking at how they were promoting the book, but I can't wait to read it. It says, pulsating with action from the first page to the last, Dangerous Company, Misadventures of a Foreign Agent is a memoir that reads like a thriller. Sam Patten left U.S. politics behind when he went overseas to promote a democracy during George W. Bush's first administration. Then he became an advisor to political leaders in countries like Iraq, Georgia, Ukraine, the Congo, Nigeria, and Mexico. When Washington went looking for anyone who could have helped the Russians elect Donald Trump as U.S. president, Patten was a usual suspect. Says that he ended up, as I just mentioned, a rarely enforced, seldom enforced statute of 1938, which was the Foreign Agent Register Act. It's actually called FARA, but it's Foreign Agent Registration Act. And I mean, we were just talking, he worked for three of the senators in Maine, William Cohen, who became Secretary of Defense, Senator at first, Senator Susan Collins, Senator Olympia Snowe. He ran the George W. Bush campaign in Maine, worked in the State Department in 2008-9, and then he went and did all these things overseas. When he was in Ukraine, Paul Manafort was over there. That's something that a name that everybody knows. But if you get a chance, his column that he writes in the Maine Wire is very topical, right on what's going on right now. And he's got an opinion because he's been a part of all of it. Can't wait to unpack all this. Before we do that, I want to introduce our sponsor for the show, Auto Plaza Direct. You know, who likes spending a couple of weekends walking the car lots looking for a car? Then you find the car, you spend 4 or 5 hours in the dealership to buy a car. There's a better way. Take away all this pain and hassle getting a car. Auto Plaza Direct, they're like your personal car concierge. Just tell them the car you want, what you can pay, and they'll go find that car for you. They'll negotiate your best price and deliver the car to you in any state. They also offer you warranties and financing, full service. Go to autoplazadirect.com to get started with your personal car concierge. The new hassle-free way, the car buying experience you deserve. Auto Plaza Direct. Tell them that Brent from Nightmare Success sent you. Sam Patten, welcome in. How are you?
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Brent.
I can see your books in the back there. When do those come out?
It officially launches on October 3rd, but I've already got about 700 of them sitting in my dining room just to get rid of.
That's the world of publishing your book. I love it. I can't wait to see you out there promoting it too. So, Sam, let's go back a little bit. Because we were just talking about you lived a fascinating life from Maine to Washington, D.C. What was life for you as a kid growing up?
Well, I grew up in Maine, but I was born in Washington D.C., so I had some roots there that kept me kind of focused on politics from an early age. My grandparents were very involved in public life in D.C. My step grandfather was a columnist, stopped writing after Vietnam, and my grandmother was sort of a society figure in Washington D.C. For a number of years from the Kennedy administration until her death in 2004.
And she, you know, Washington Post called her the grand dame of the Washington elite society. And we were talking about, you know, when you were going to school at Georgetown and you were able to be part of some of those, I guess, those dinners and cocktail parties. And what would that have been like for you in that world?
Yeah, I know it gave me a certain perspective and insight that, you know, as we say here in Maine, you know, say I'm just a boy from Maine. Well, I was just a boy from Maine, kind of put into a very fancy world in Washington D.C. and had to learn at an early age how to make dinner party conversation, how to be interesting. The worst possible thing was to be boring.
Exactly.
That was something that
was a party foul. Yes.
Yeah, that haunted me throughout my life. But no, it gave me exposure to some fascinating people, some sort of historical people. When I was studying American foreign policy in college, I got to listen to Dick Helms, who was a former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, talk to Frank Wisner, who was the son of a sort of an epic foreign intelligence figure in the United States, talk about what really happened in Tehran in the 1950s during the Mossadegh coup. So, I mean, you know, these were sort of live, real-time conversations that were kind of sinking in my head and probably playing some role in determining my future.
I'm sure. I mean, you were in the thick of it. Who do you think was the most interesting person you got to be around in that time period?
Gosh, there were a lot of different people, but I remember after working on the Bush campaign in 2000, I was the fall guy for when the news about Bush's DWI came out several days before the election. I was the guy they dropped that on. And so after the election, I was having a quiet dinner in D.C. with my grandmother and Jim Lehrer, who was the host of the news hour on PBS, and his wife. And I was explaining to Jim Lehrer what that was like. And he, in fact, had just he had moderated the debate between Bush and Gore. And he shared what it was like when George W. Bush was staring at him like, do something, because Gore wasn't playing by the rules, was being very sort of supercilious, you know, was sort of acting out a little bit. And he talked about what the pressure was like to be the moderator in the debate. And I told him what it was like to have that popped on me. And, you know, it was interesting. That was a memorable conversation, but certainly there have been many. Another would be Paul Nitze, who was a longtime senior diplomat and chief U.S. arms negotiator and national security advisor, I think, for President Truman. He asked me, who are your heroes? And I didn't have an answer. And it troubled me that I didn't have an answer. Nothing quickly came to mind, and this would have been 1990. 92. Today, if you asked me that question, wow, I really didn't know.
Yeah, 92. That would have been Bush, H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton.
But you know, I couldn't. No one sprung to mind. I think that's a little bit about the disillusionment of our age. I mean, you know, I grew up in the latchkey generation, Generation X, through the funk of the 70s. So there is there is this idea of the hero is a little distant.
It gets diluted, and people get cynical, and they think it's not cool to have a hero. You know, people. Right. It's an unusual place that we sit now with that, because I think that's part of what made our country great was we had heroes to aspire to, and you know, from handing the baton off from one generation to the next of who's going to be the next great. When you were growing up, were your high school year, did you have siblings?
I have two younger sisters,
okay.
One of whom lives in Berkeley and the other in Brooklyn.
Okay. And pretty normal growing up, high school, time period? Because you got into working with the senators fairly young. I assume was that during college or out of college?
My father published a weekly newspaper in our hometown.
Yeah.
So my first job after school, I went to university down in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., and that's where I got an internship working for Bill Cohen, who was our senior senator at the time. So, that got me involved in politics. My first job out of school was as a newspaper reporter, and that got me, focused, more on politics. And I met a woman who was running for governor in 1994 and went to work for her as her press secretary. So that was my first statewide political campaign. I think we were the only Republican campaign in 1994 that didn't win.
That's interesting. Did it seem odd or was it a great learning ground to go from being in journalism to basically writing and doing speeches for the political sector, or was it just a natural plug-in for you?
I think journalism was more of a default, something that I could do based on, what my skills were at that point, and I like to write. But I think I was more naturally drawn to politics even before that.
Yeah.
So I've always been, my journalism has always been political. And in fact, last year I got canceled from 3 newspapers I was writing for in Mid-Coast, Maine, for being too partisan. I was a columnist.
That's what you're supposed to do as a columnist.
Should be allowed to have an opinion, but it was the wrong opinion. And
right.
I was critical of our congresswoman, who was quite beloved and a touch precious. So, yeah. So that's always plagued me in journalism and writing. It's been my political views, which I sometimes find hard to hide.
How did you evolve from that into? I know you stepped also into the State Department, and how did you get from where you were with the senators and working your way through that to getting in the State Department, but then? And I think I read in one of your things that your interviews is you were bored with U.S. Politics, and you thought the excitement and the adventure was overseas. How did that come to you?
Well, I was a student in university in the late 80s and early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So I was taking a course on Soviet foreign policy in the political science faculty one semester, and then the same course shifted to the history faculty the next semester. So there was a sense. We also had the first Gulf War happen while I was in school. So, these things were happening in the world. The Cold War was ending. There were new threats and new forces that America would have to contend with. And this seemed like it was the interesting story. At home, everyone was talking about what was on Friends, and I didn't really care about Friends.
Right.
So,
well, but I mean, you have to be wired a certain way, Sam. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, I know a lot of people that talk politics and have opinions about politics, but I don't have any friends that have gone overseas and worked in elections in Nigeria or the Congo or the Ukraine or speak Russian and have the ability to move around Moscow. I mean, that is a different gear for someone to get into. Was the feeling excitement? Was it nervousness? What were your connections to get into that?
Well, I think it was a little natural too, just in terms of bringing different worlds together. And that's been something that I've always been interested in, kind of by necessity since I was a little kid, coming from, privilege on one side and then living, Maine's one of the poorest states in the country. Alabama's ahead of us in terms of
I did
GDP.
not know that.
I mean, you have the fancy people who come on the coast in the summer, but, it's a rural state that struggles economically. So, the realities of where I grew up were certainly not lost on me. And so bridging those two worlds is something I did from an early age. I think my family has long been focused on foreign affairs and diplomacy. And I noticed growing up that the smartest, most sensitive kids that I encountered were the children of diplomats, because they were quiet, They paid attention. They were more sophisticated. They understood what was going on, and they were intellectually curious in a way that other people weren't. So all of that was very attractive to me. And I think the combination of the historical forces that were in play and, my love of history and desire to be part of that is what brought me overseas.
So Sam, how does it happen when you decide, hey, I've been in this world, this political world, I want to go and create change abroad? You don't just give your resume to somebody, do you?
Yeah, no, you don't. It's a very bespoke, very narrow niche. It happened two ways, I'd say. The first way was a failed political campaign in 1994. I was working for a woman named Susan Collins, who was running for governor of Maine. That year, she was not elected. It was my first statewide campaign. Losing was hard, particularly as it was like my second job out of school.
Yeah.
And I was looking for something very different. And I found an opportunity in Kazakhstan to go to the former Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan and teach English and help manage graduates at a business school in Kazakhstan that had just been set up with foreign donor money. And it was fascinating. It was the Wild East. It was what the Wild West would have been for young Americans 100, 120 years ago. So that was one way that got me into the area.
And you spoke Russian, correct?
I learned.
Did you learn it?
I don't speak fluent Russian, but I learned sort of pidgin Russian, how to get along.
Yeah.
In that process. And I also met my first wife in Kazakhstan, so that linked me to that part of the world. And our son is half Kazakh, so I've always been sensitive to the need for him to be in touch with that side of his heritage and so forth.
What was life like in that world that you were in? Because people don't know much about that region. Like living there as an American, was it primitive? Was it?
It was exotic.
Yeah,
it was like not far from Mongolia. Big steppe in Almaty, where I was near China. It's up in the mountains. Very pretty.
Yeah,
and it's almost like a movie because it's so different from our reality. And, it changed over that period of time. That was in the early 90s. And then oil wealth, the country sits on a tremendous amount of oil, started changing the country as well as other forces too. And it became, in some ways, more westernized, but it's, between East and West.
But I read you got involved with Kazakhstan oil in some form or fashion. Is that correct?
I worked for a couple oil companies. I worked for Chevron, the U.S. major out of California, first, doing PR. And then my boss at Chevron left and went to run a wildcat operation, or a small oil company run by Canadians, which was a more interesting assignment in a way because you saw the full operation. Chevron, obviously a global corporation. This was a much smaller show, and he was the president, and I was his aide-de-camp. So we were solving problems as varied as what to do with camel meat so it doesn't spoil, because we had a camel farm, a vodka distillery. This is how
one-stop shop
set up horizontally. Right, we had to get rid of all these assets and pay the workers, 5,000 workers who hadn't been paid in years. So it was a challenge, and it was fascinating.
Well, and the interesting thing is that while you were there, you had Boris Yeltsin. They were wanting to be. He wanted to be like America, the red, white, and blue, and things went awry. And this goes to the second. This is just the first thing. Just got me to that part of the world. The second kind of change point, I guess, would have been when I went back to work for Susan Collins again. She ran for Senate for Cohen's seat. She won. She was elected. And I went to work for her eventually in Washington. And, the life of a Senate aide wasn't really what I was cut out for, I don't think, as the future will later show. Sure.
But I would try and hide from the office whenever I could, because you'd be chained to your desk and you'd be sitting there watching C-SPAN and waiting for somebody to call you up and tell you what to do.
Right.
And so I'd go down to the barber shop and get my shoes shined when I needed a little stretch the legs, get some fresh air. And I was waiting to get my shoes shined, and there were two guys ahead of me, and they were talking about democracy building in Mongolia. And having been in Kazakhstan, this got my attention.
Sure.
And I focused on it. I was actively eavesdropping until finally I just interrupted them, and I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And one of them was the clerk on the Senate Appropriations Committee, and he had worked for a nonprofit that did this kind of work. And they told me about the International Republican Institute. There's also a National Democratic Institute, both funded by the U.S. taxpayer, that train political parties overseas. And that seemed incredibly interesting to me.
Sure.
And so I contacted IRI, and they hired me as their Russia program officer initially in D.C., which was nice. It was fun to have an issue focused, single issue focused job in D.C. And then I ended up being their country director in Moscow. Speaking Russian, with my wife speaking fluent Russian, it made sense, and we lived in Russia for the first 3 years of the Putin administration, which were.
You got to tell me about that, because the way that I see that is that maybe the United States missed an opportunity in the 90s to really help the way that we, when the USSR fell, and they said it was the end of the Cold War, we oftentimes, with Japan or Germany or whomever, would go in and help that country become what it needed to be able to thrive. We didn't really do that with Russia as much as we would or could have. And when I think about what happened in '99 with Putin, I think that the population got scared. Where are they going to eat? What are they going to do? How are they going to live? And my personal opinion is that possibly we missed a gigantic opportunity to become part of what they needed. And maybe they wouldn't have run into the arms of an old KGB guy.
You're right in that there was no Marshall Plan. There was no massive reconstruction. Instead, we sent them some half-baked advisors from Harvard who told them to do a mass privatization program.
Yeah.
And the result of that mass privatization program was the birth of the class of oligarchs. And the Russians get credit. My late friend, who was later murdered, Boris Nemtsov, coined the phrase oligarch. It's a Greek term. We have our oligarchs. Every country has oligarchs. This class of ultra-rich, ultra-influential people. Mm-hmm. And so Russia's class of oligarchs was born in the early 90s out of the corruption that grew out of this process that we told them to do. I think, we did two things. Yes, there's a little bit of benign neglect on one side, but we were also infantilizing them on the other. The assistance we did give them was not always useful, constructive assistance.
Yeah.
For instance, Ben and Jerry's had a multi-million-dollar grant to teach the Russians how to make ice cream. Well, the Russians know how to make ice cream. It's just, some politically connected person at USAID thought it would be cool and groovy to have Ben and Jerry in Moscow. Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of mistakes made, and I don't think out of ill intent necessarily, but the smartest people that we had on it, people like Strobe Talbot, Bill Clinton's Oxford roommate, he, by his own admission, had to turn the plane around once because he got the Russians so wrong. Yeah. And I think one, he was shuttling back and forth during the war in the Balkans and Serbia, trying to do diplomacy, and he just missed it. As we often missed it with the Russians.
Sure.
In a way, we weren't paying attention. And I don't want to lay too much blame all on the Clinton administration, because when the Bush administration came in, Bush got them wrong initially, too. Mm-hmm. Remember, he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul.
Exactly.
I think what happened then is when the Bush administration came in, they had so much going on. They just decided Russia is not a priority.
Yeah.
See, the previous administration said, "Oh, you're a big priority. Let's have the Gore-Chernomyrdin working groups, where we have 100 sub-working groups, and we have all these people frantically running back and forth, talking a lot." And that was the sort of assistance we were giving them then. Then the Bush administration came and said, "We're not even going to do that.
Yeah. Well, no, timing is everything with foreign policy too. I mean, when 9/11 happens, I mean, everything is focused on a whole different type of world.
And then September 11th happened, and Putin was the first call, which made such a big impression on Bush.
Exactly.
Right. And so that bought them a few more years of good grace until they invaded Georgia in 2008. And that's when the Bush administration finally got it.
Understood what was happening. But I want to go back, though, Sam, because not too many people have lived in your shoes, in your world. What was it like in that time period when Putin's taking over, the country's becoming part of what it is, 20 some odd years later now? But what was your world like?
I lived my family and I lived in a little attic apartment in a nice part of inner Moscow, right by where there's a famous novel called Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, and right where that novel begins, in Patriarchy Prudi is where we lived. And we were lucky to live in a very nice area of Moscow, and we had a somewhat sheltered life there. But I remember, in the evenings watching Russian television, and Putin would have his cabinet meetings televised, and he would be sitting at the end, as we all famously now know, a long table, and all his underlings would be around the table looking down and being quiet while he lectured them. And my wife said to me, who grew up under communism, she said, that's really creepy, don't you think? Mm-hmm. I mean, she was the one who pointed out to me how creepy it was. There was a chilling effect, and it was clear to me, largely because I was working with opposition parties, with Yabloko and the Union of Right Forces. So I could see what the government was doing step by step. And again, we didn't push back hard at any of these at any of these little steps, shutting down this television station, shutting down that television station, changing this law, changing that law. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a series of different things that happen. And it was frustrating, and in the end, it was a little bit heartbreaking.
Yeah, and generally, as an American, I mean, you would have been moving around in the streets as an American. How were you accepted, and your wife accepted in that world? Were you like a rock star American that, oh my gosh, this is an American who's over here doing great things, or was it?
No, the Russians' views of Americans are not that. Russians are, shall we say, somewhat skeptical of Americans in general. Things they like about our culture and our society, but they're also things that they don't like so much. And I've got a piece coming out in The Spectator this month on what Solzhenitsyn, the late Soviet dissident who came to the United States and was given shelter by the Americans. And then he went to Harvard in 1978 and blasted us. He called us soulless and legalistic, and that we don't know what to do with our freedom, and it's meaningless freedom.
Interesting.
And some of his points actually, they hurt because they stuck.
They hit a point. Yeah.
They hit some raw areas. Yeah. And I think that would be applicable today. In my piece, I talk about legalism.
Yep.
And are we an excessively legalistic country? Are we trusting the legal system to do too much? Are we, particularly now that half of America is chomping at the bit to indict a former president, while the other half of America is chomping at the bit to indict the current president's son. So you have this, you have this reliance on the legal system that, in a way, seems frighteningly undemocratic. But we'll see how that plays out.
Well, it's playing out right now, and it's. I don't know. Do you think anything historically matches anything that we're looking at right now, except for the Civil War?
Well, I think that's a pretty stark comparison.
But I mean, if you look at the two sides, I mean, you had the North fighting the South, and they actually went to war over, and we had a president, Abraham Lincoln, that was able to bring it all back together. But I feel like now, if you look at where we sit as a country, I know for a fact. Well, it's not a fact, it's an opinion, but I'll never live to see a president win 49 states again. It just won't, I can't imagine that happening. And that wasn't that long ago. Ronald Reagan was 84.
A lot more polarized, but I don't know. I mean, the question about the Civil War is, what drove us take away the moral wrong of slavery,
Mm-hmm.
what precipitated the Civil War was half of the country taking away the livelihood of the other half.
Yep.
And I think that's something we have to be a little bit careful about when we get preachy in the country about things that I saw on Netflix or one of the streaming channels, a movie about a reformed hunter. And to be fair, it was a European movie.
Okay.
We haven't gone that far yet.
Okay.
But what does that mean?
What does that mean?
Is hunting wrong?
Right.
Are we criminalizing things like hunting? We see
When it was a hunting and gathering society at one point.
Yeah, we see the Dutch criminalizing farming.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think there are certain things we have to be careful about. And I think COVID did this to us as well, because half of America was able to sit at home on their laptops and fret, and the other half of America had to go to work.
Exactly.
And so, there were two very different views that we saw. And one side was preaching to the other how to behave.
And that continues to widen the gap.
We're trying to survive, thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think that continues to widen the gap too,
And that's a problem.
Yeah.
We need to be very careful about that.
I agree with that. So you're rolling around in Moscow for what, 3 years? What's your next step?
Well, we went to war in Iraq. America went to war in Iraq, and Russia was always, particularly in the Bush administration, as I said, kind of an afterthought. The organization that I worked for was much more interested in Ukraine than they were Russia, because the assumption was the Russians will always be autocratic, corrupt, and sort of cranky.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was sort of Russia was considered not the hot ticket for the future, and we had just invaded Iraq, and they were about to have an election there. So it seemed like that made sense. I went to Russia just after or during September 11th.
Mm-hmm.
So I focused while I was in Russia on outreach to the Muslim community in the country, which you'd be surprised, it's much larger than you think. It's 15 to 20%.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought it was that big.
Women at the time were marrying Muslim men at an incredible rate. So the idea of Islam and democracy became fascinating just, after September 11th, and what better place to be part of that than Iraq's first free election in 50 years.
And you became part of that.
I went there as, the IRI's political director, and was training political parties across the Iraqi spectrum, including Hezbollah and the communists and, all sorts. Stiri was the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which was hanging out in Iran for a long period of time. And so, there's a big sort of array of different political forces. And of course, the country was, going through this tremendous change and had gone through this horrible hardship and was continuing to go through hardship. So when the election actually did happen and was able to, the Iraqis were able to pull it off despite all of the security threats that were increasing, it was a wonderful feeling of accomplishment, irrespective of what would come next.
Yeah, no, and I would think it would be.
That there would be more and even better elections.
Were you optimistic at that point? Because at that point in time, that was a big event that happened that this country, who had Saddam Hussein and all the things that went with that, went to the polls and actually had an election. Were you in that moment feeling like this is the beginning of something that could really be, because we needed allies in that region. I often look at, Iraq on one side, Afghanistan on the other. What if everything would have been a way that we could have squeezed on both sides and had two allies that we had, between Iran? I don't know. It could have gone differently, maybe, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, we still view the world as a chessboard, and the problem is our ability to play chess is getting worse and worse.
That's true.
So we're not the grand chess masters anymore. So that argues for a different way of looking at the world, and how do we advance peace and security? And there's the whole two countries with McDonald's have never gone to war. I don't know if that's still the case, but there's a general thought that two democracies have never gone to war. And so by spreading democracy, we are increasing In fact, that was part of the Bush national security strategy, and I think other national security strategies in the past as well. That by advancing democracy, we're advancing the nation's security, because it's the political instability in other countries that creates problems for us in the long run.
Well, I think that's somewhat, where you look at Ronald Reagan's beginnings of you look at Grenada when that happened down there, and it was a quick hit. And, there's times and places where I think what you're saying, Sam, is true, that was the belief for a number of years, that if we could just get everybody with free elections and democracy, then we're protecting everybody. And at some point, it kind of looked that way, when the USSR fell and it looked like it was going to fall towards, our side. That was a different feeling until it all fell apart. What if the good
guys don't win?
What if the good guys don't win? Right.
Did the non-communists steal the 1996 election in Russia? And there's ample evidence to say yes, they did. That the Russian people were so appalled at what they saw termed as capitalism in the first 5 years of independence, that the communists had a better message.
Yeah, a scared population.
Would have won a free and fair election if it hadn't been for massive abuse of what the Russians called administrative resource, or we call abuse of power. So that's an ordinary thing there. Or Egypt, after Tahrir Square, the Islamists won. And suddenly Washington's confused and doesn't know what to do, because those aren't the people we do business with. So, that's the complication of when people vote. People are going to win the current prime minister of India, Mr. Modi, is somebody Washington has long looked down their nose at. But he's been prime minister now for 15 years, and they have to deal with him.
Yep.
The same goes for Erdogan in Turkey. So, what do we do? Or Orban in Hungary, who George Soros, who is Hungarian himself, has spent tremendous amounts of money trying to change the Hungarian government unsuccessfully, since his friends in the Social Democrats were last in power.
It's a good point. It's a good point, really, Sam. I love the point, though. What if the good guys don't win? You still have a democracy that you have to deal with on the foreign policy.
Yeah. Because that's, when the government came for me, they didn't like my client. That's why. And that's a little bit of an issue, and that's a whole separate conversation about Ukraine and choosing the good guys and the bad guys. I don't think we're qualified to do that.
Well, I want to get into that too, because how long were you in Iraq?
I was in Iraq for about a year. I was down in Baghdad for about a year, and then I did some work up north with the Kurds for another 6 months or so.
Did you feel like when you were in Iraq that in that year's time that things were improving, or did you feel like you were fearing for your life and everywhere you walked you could step on a landmine?
They were steeply deteriorating. Our compound was bombed towards the end, and I ended up the last 2 or 3 weeks in Iraq I spent living under my desk in the office because our house was blown up. So we came under friendly fire multiple times. In order to travel around Baghdad, you'd have to have a personal security detail and basically be prepared for combat all the time. On the upside, I developed some really good stomach muscles, because wearing a Kevlar vest in the Iraqi summer is a workout.
Well, so how do you end up in Africa?
I've been interested in Africa ever since school. I studied African politics in school. And so I was actively looking for opportunities. I went to Nigeria for Cambridge Analytica for a presidential campaign there in 2015. And then the following year, I spent some time in Congo working on a transition of power project. Do you see it as it's, if you read certain articles about China with Africa, with South America, that they're just slowly but consistently penetrating and building the roads and the factories and the jobs? And do you see? Yes. See that, you hear that.
And we're not.
Presence in Africa is everywhere. And a Congolese explained it to me in an interesting way, a young guy who said to me, we like them better. And we like them better because they come up the river and they live with us. When they're selling all their plastic schlock and all the things that, made in China, they paddle this stuff up the river, to these villages to develop trading outposts the same way, figures in Joseph Conrad novels were, 150 years ago. So they're there, they're present. However, Africans also realize that the type of projects that the Chinese are foisting on them are not always in their interest, and they're a form of economic colonialism. I think there's a sense of that, that Africans who have been so stigmatized by colonialism over the last, 200 years are sensitive to having their resources pillaged by anyone, whether they're Westerners or Chinese. So I think that, anyone who shows up in town with a fat wallet when people are hungry is going to get attention. But I think also a lot of Africans are thinking, what kind of partner do they want for the long term? Because things are blowing Africa's way, I think, for the next century. They're exploding population.
They have resources.
They have the resources, and they also have an optimism that I've seen nowhere else in the world.
That's interesting. And it's big. It's a big place.
Disease, poverty, conflict, and it's really amazing.
Yeah, and it's a continent, so I mean, it's a big place, and so you sweep through Africa. You get involved with some of the elections there. I want to get to Ukraine. Was that your next step?
Well, I wish I did more work in Africa. That's sort of been a work in progress for me. But the former Soviet Union has been my space throughout my career, or had been. And Ukraine, I ended up going. I did a campaign in Ukraine in 2007, and I returned in 2014 to work for the remnants of a political party that had just been thrown out of power by a popular revolution. So,
Sam, when you're rolling in this world, are you rolling into the same people that, that guy that's doing that campaign, you're doing this campaign, you kind of go and eat at the same places? I mean, how does that world work?
It's a small enough world that who's working on the other side.
Yeah.
You tend not to, get together with your opponent because it's, your client wouldn't be amused.
Right.
For good reason. This is the outcome matters to them. Sure. I mean, it matters to you too professionally, but their clients don't tend to like that very much. But yes,
you're over in Ukraine in 2007, but you came back and worked in the State Department in 2008 through 2009, correct?
Yeah, and when I went back to Ukraine, I went to work for the people I'd worked against before.
I read that. I thought that was interesting.
And it was the third country I've done that in. I've done that in Iraq and Georgia, the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, before. So it was the third country that I'd worked two sides in. And
what was the vibe? What was the vibe in Ukraine when you were doing the work that you were doing?
It was edgy. There had just had a popular revolution. The former president was living in exile in Russia. The new government was trying to legitimize itself, but you also had the same oligarchic struggles under the carpet that, had been happening all along. So it was a question of what the perception of things were versus what was really happening. And I think now working on another side in the country, I would get another perspective. And I think in politics that can be very useful because too often you sort of drink your own Kool-Aid and you believe everything that your team or your tribe believes. And I think it's important to see it from the other side.
Yeah, always. And
the post-Maidan government, we were, I say we, the Eastern Ukrainians, the Southeastern Ukrainians who were our voters, were having a hard time. The same way Sunnis were in Iraq after, the invasion, because there was a sense of collective punishment.
All those years.
Crimea had just been seized, and there was sort of a sense, this is your fault, when it wasn't their fault. And, sometimes we push people into corners, and it's never a wise strategy. But you had Western Ukrainians standing up in parliament and calling Eastern Ukrainians subhuman. And those of us who've studied genocide know that that's a real bad warning sign when one group of people starts just dehumanizing another group of people. So there were legitimate interests and concerns. And the crimes that I would later commit against our country involved asking the United States to be balanced in its approach to Ukraine.
In the world that you were rolling in, there was Paul Manafort over. Obviously, Hunter Biden was there with Burisma.
He was rolling a little higher than I was, I think.
He was rolling in a very high area spot with what he was doing. Did you ever run into into him?
No, I didn't travel in
his circle.
Those circles. What Burisma was a company owned by somebody who was so corrupt in the view of that current Ukrainian government that they were hiding in London. Mm. So I don't know how much time they were actually spending in Ukraine, but who knows? There are all sorts of people blowing through Ukraine, and certainly there still are now. But my focus was always on the Ukrainians, not the visiting firemen. Mm-hmm. I mean, I worked for the former mayor or the current mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko. Before me, he had Rudy Giuliani working for him.
Interesting.
I don't think Giuliani did him, too many favors. So you had all these characters sort of cycling through. Roger Stone was supposed to be working for the people that I ended up working for, but he got busy with something else in New York in 2014, 2015. And so that opened an opportunity for me.
And it's interesting because when you're described as the silent, stealthy guy that just gets to and from, and there's a lot of people that aren't. Did that play to your favor? Because they don't say that as I think it comes across to me as complimentary that you were able to move in so many different worlds and affect change, but not take on, wearing the hat that I'm the guy.
Well, I think I guess that helps you as a self-promoter and may help you grow business, but it doesn't help your ability to deliver the business.
Deliver the goods, yeah.
To deliver the goods. And I'd rather see my clients, do well and get publicity than myself.
All right, let's walk into this nightmare that the whole world, especially the United States, knows about. When this started happening, and as it started happening, did you feel like that you were going to be wrapped up in the storm, or were you looking at it from afar thinking, wow, that's some interesting, wild stuff? I don't think Russia elected the president.
Some elements of concern. I was pepped at my bank, which means I was designated as a politically exposed person and a target for potential corruption. I had the bank manager take me aside and tell me they didn't want my business anymore.
Probably scared them to death.
Because I was getting wire transfers from the Seychelles, and that freaked them out. Mm-hmm. And I guess I understand with compliance and liability and all that. So yes, there were warning signs certainly. And then when the boom started coming down on Paul Manafort, mm-hmm. Who I had worked in parallel with briefly, that was also a concern. And when the U.S. government considered my business partner, Konstantin Kalimnik, started labeling him as a Russian agent, the combination of all these things started looking really bad. And what I was worried about from the very beginning, and I'd just been in Washington long enough to sort of understand this, is, these scandals are like wildfires. And I saw a wildfire coming that was not substantiated by anything, to my knowledge, that was real. Yeah. I mean, if Paul and Kostya, and by extension me and some other bozos, were responsible for putting Donald Trump in the White House on behalf of Russia, then what else could be true?
Well, I mean, it is crazy when you look at the scandals as they go through Whitewater with Bill Clinton was the beginnings of, and it ends up with a dress. It's crazy how
But is there a common denominator?
Usually,
one particular family of low moral character that came into town, and anyway,
that's a whole other podcast.
But just if you look at it, right around 1991, too, is when all of this hit. Started getting Watergate, yes, yep. But some figures in that family were active in Watergate and got their cut their teeth during that time. So anyway, we'll leave that aside because it's the past. But yes,
So let's get back to where you were, though, Sam.
Yeah.
You Manafort. All of a sudden, the bank says something. Your partner is identified. The walls, and there's nothing like. I mean, you and I have both gone through.
And Cambridge Analytica, which
Cambridge Analytica, that was part of
implodes because of Facebook.
Exactly. So, and you might explain Cambridge Analytica, because that is the genesis of a lot of this.
Well, it is and it isn't. Cambridge Analytica was a British consulting firm, a London-based political consulting firm that I came into contact with some years, maybe 5-6 years earlier. They hired me to work on projects in a couple of different countries, and initially to try and work in the United States too. And they ended up working for Trump via Ted Cruz. And in this sort of wild hysteria to explain how Trump became president, Cambridge Analytica was another one of these strands, this dark, British, secretive, MI6 related political consulting firm, which was all hype, essentially. It was just a political consulting firm like any other that did data analytics, like anyone else did. Mm-hmm. And there was nothing particularly nefarious about micro-targeting. It's something that's been done in this country.
But it was basically to find the dirt on the other person and make it part of
not even that. It wasn't the dirt, because that's a different part of politics, opposition research. It's to make a psychological profile of the voter. That was the offer.
I get that.
Was that we could make, that we had enough data to
what does your voter look like?
Exactly. Yep. But also not just what do they look like demographically, but what do they look like psychographically?
Okay.
And what are their dominant, sort of think of the Myers-Briggs, there's another scale called Ocean. What are the dominant traits and characteristics? You know, it used to be neuroticism was something that Republicans had the lock on, right? We were all neurotic, but then that bled out to everybody. Now everybody's neurotic in politics. Who's more open? You know, people in North Carolina might be more open and agreeable than people, where I am in New England, where people are sort of crustier. And, so there are different psychological characteristics. To pinpoint them to the individual, though, is quite challenging, no matter how much data you have.
I would think so.
It's an interesting intellectual exercise. But, they had been working in the United States. They'd been working for Trump. There'd been some issue about their use of Facebook data that almost crushed Facebook, and it ended up creating big problems for Cambridge Analytica, and they went out of business. But this was all happened at the same time that the FBI showed up at my house. So I didn't know what was going to fall out.
And I've read this account that there's a longer article, and you want to, let's walk through that, because it had to be an odd, strange thing for you that they, and I think that they showed up previously and asked for your dad, and which was odd.
While I was traveling with my wife, and my son answered the door. They didn't identify themselves. They asked for me and said they'd be back.
Yeah.
And my son told me, I was at the airport coming home, and he told me about this. And I said, well, can you describe them? Who do you think they were? And he said, I think they were with the government. And I said, why? He said, because of suits.
They looked like suits. FBI guys.
But they didn't leave a calling card. And then later when they came, they were very interested in my Ring, the doorbell with the video.
Yeah.
In other words, I guess they wanted to know if I had a recording of that. But
walk us through that day, because that you do in the article, but I write about this in the book too. Yeah.
I'm sitting in my office is in the basement, and I'm working on a piece for a client and in another part of the world, and I'm talking to somebody in I think Jerusalem. I'm talking to somebody somewhere else, and I'm not necessarily focused on what's happening right there on Capitol Hill in Washington D.C. And my dog starts barking like crazy, and my wife has actually just left the FBI, where she'd been working in the art crime division, and she's working now from home for a financial services company. And she answers the door, and there are a couple agents, and the barking continues. Pepper won't stop. So then I come out from another door to see what's going on. And as we do these days, we carry our phones around with us everywhere.
Yeah.
And they've been talking to Laura, my ex-wife, who had been asking them to, what they wanted and so forth. And they turned and they pointed at my phone and they said, that's what we want. And they said, no, you're not taking the phone without a warrant. And they said, we've got a warrant. And so they all came inside and started sort of unpacking my phone, so to speak. And while we tried to make polite small talk and, figure out what was going to happen next.
What's going through your mind at this moment as they're rifling through your phone and your contacts?
I am, it feels exposed. It's not the first time I felt exposed, because I'd already 6 months before voluntarily submitted 1,000 pages of email to the Senate Intelligence Committee. And then newspaper reporters started somehow knowing what was in those confidential productions to the Senate. Mm-hmm. I started getting phone calls asking me about things that I had only told the Senate Intelligence Committee.
Lots of leaks.
So yeah. And there's a whole nother story there. Again, let's stay on the positive. But yeah, I was feeling very exposed, incredibly exposed.
What happens?
And to have other people interpret your emails your thoughts and tell you what you were thinking because it suits their narrative.
And there is a narrative. And by the time they get to your door, they've already constructed their narrative. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, I was a collateral damage in a big dumpster fire, and they had run out of fuel. I think they'd already exhausted all of the false information they'd been fed by the Clinton campaign, and they were desperate for anything that they could, say this wasn't a complete boondoggle.
Mm-hmm. Next step, what happens?
So the next step is, I change lawyers. My fancy corporate lawyer fires me because now I'm a grubby criminal.
Sure.
And I hire a criminal lawyer, and that criminal lawyer goes into talks with the special counsel who Robert Mueller had signed the subpoena. And those talks continued for a while, and they said that they were going to charge me with a number of crimes, including the one that I ended up pleading guilty to, the Foreign Agent Registration Act violation, but also money laundering for getting tickets to the inauguration.
Read that one.
For Trump, for some Ukrainians. They made a big deal out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one was obstruction of justice because I did not hand over to the Senate Intelligence Committee some emails about how I bought the tickets for Ukrainians to the Senate Intelligence Committee that was investigating Russian interference in the U.S. election.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter because anything, you know what I mean?
Sure.
Right. So the law is what they say it is, basically. Money laundering is what the government says money laundering is.
Well, I mean, once you're deemed doing something illegal, anything you bought is money laundering. It's a terrible sounding word, but when we went down, that we ran a company for 30 years, and everything we did was money laundering because they deemed the enterprise to be wrong. Going back into the personal side of it, though, Sam, your wife, your kids, how is that? Because it's such a big story, and now you're getting wrapped up in this gigantic thing that people are watching daily and opinionated about and all those different things. How are you relating this back to your wife and kids, and how are you getting through this?
It was hard on different levels with different members of my family. It was least hard with my son because because of the Soviet heritage, he knows that the law is not always right. Mm-hmm. His maternal grandfather is a dissident in Kazakhstan who had been beaten up by thugs who worked for the president. So he gets it.
Some history of it. Yeah.
Yeah, he was in fact, that year was his junior year. No, it was his senior year in high school. And his school project, his voluntary school project, was he made a movie about Chinese interference in the school elections.
Wow.
So that was how he processed it. And I thought it was quite clever. My wife, it was more difficult because she, now my ex-wife, had been, she worked as an operations officer for the CIA for 10 years. And then she had been working for the FBI as an art crimes analyst literally until months before they popped me. So I think she was a bit more conflicted. I think her whole career had been about the government being a force of good in the world, and I think she saw a different side of that, and I think that was hard and just disorienting, massively disorienting. And then my family. I come from a very liberal family. I'm a conservative by choice. I'm not a Trumper, but that shouldn't matter, really. And I felt most of my family were also split between this sort of TDS that was going on in the country, this Trump derangement syndrome, and their love for me. Mm-hmm. And I think that the latter won out in the end. But I was always fighting against TDS. And the amazing thing about my mother just finished the book, and she called me the other day. It made my day. She said, you really were set up.
Yeah. That had to mean a lot.
This is 2024, and all of this happened in 2018. So it took 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
And the book helped tell that story. So.
Yeah, and I, in writing a book, I got a similar call from my mom, and it's, after you go through what you go through, and then you have somebody that's that close that got your message, and you were able to get it. What I like about what you're doing with your book is that obviously you have grown up in the world of the written word, but being able to put that in to story form so people can really follow from piece to piece, chapter to chapter. And, the more I think people get information, and you brought this up earlier, from the two sides need to hear each other. And this is an attempt, I think, on your part to be heard so that people can make sense out of the craziness that we're all swimming through.
Well, it's a struggle to do that in our country today, and whether or not I succeed is, will be interesting because I'm kind of in the middle. I mean, obviously, the quote-unquote mainstream media wasn't super interested in my story because, so many of them were vocally promoting.
Yeah, they took
Russia.
The narrative on the other side. Right.
I'm an inconvenient data point, so to speak. So it's better not to focus on. So I get that. I don't expect a lot of favors from the mainstream media, but then the conservative media will say, "Oh, I'm kind of a rhino. Mm-hmm. I'm not really on board with the program. Yeah. I think we should arm Ukraine." I mean, these are things that make me somewhat suspicious to the Fox News crowd.
Yeah, you're on your island.
Yeah. So I'm in between. Yeah. I'm in between these two warring sides. But here's the thing.
You're kind of like an Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Kennedy family of events.
I hope not. Because he didn't survive in the Kennedy family.
He did not.
But to have these, I think all Americans live between these two sides. And I don't think anyone really subscribes to one or the other. I think that both sides misunderstand each other a great deal.
I agree. I totally agree with that. When you start stepping into this and you're getting that they want more information from you, and your attorney is telling you that, hey, it's probably smart to talk to these guys. And I'm assuming from what I read, he was with you in these moments. And you got to sit down with the main player who, you said that you expected to be mutilated by him, and he wasn't that way. But in the Enron book that I have read, he was quite the, I don't even know what the word would be, but aggressive, I guess. But he was reprimanded by a judge.
We're talking about Andrew Weissman here.
Yes, I am.
Robert Mueller was sort of
he was his right-hand man in the deal. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm careful in the book and in general not really to get into a whole lot of detail about my cooperation with the special counsel, because it's part of my plea agreement not to talk about it. Mm-hmm. But I have said about Weissman that, he surprised me in some ways. I'm not happy that he decided to charge me, obviously. But I wouldn't say we had a purely adversarial relationship either. So, he's obviously a driven person. I think that his record speaks for itself.
It does.
I think his record on Enron and his record on Russiagate speaks for itself. And, MSNBC doesn't, seem to think that that matters much. But the viewers will decide where they get their legal.
He has been intertwined in some big issues in the country. We could say that.
We choose our heroes in a weird way in this country, and our sacred cows, our Jim Comeys, and people who, these people hate our enemies, therefore they must be saints.
Yep. And
it's a very strange way to go about choosing your champions, and I hope it's just a phase.
I do too. As you were getting towards the end of this road that you were on, you didn't know what they were going to do. The
most they could do was put me in prison for 5 years, but that would be extreme enough that I think the Foreign Agent Registration Act of 1938 is, as you pointed out early on,
it's obscure.
I was the 9th person to be prosecuted. The reason that Hunter Biden's plea deal fell apart last week was because his lawyers had tried to work it in such a way that he would not be liable for FARA prosecution, when in fact the facts strongly suggest that he would be the poster child for FARA violation, as opposed to yours truly for writing a few op-eds and asking some friends on the Hill to see his client.
Well, the judge asked, "Are you looking at FARA?"
And everything was upside down.
Yeah.
And I've spent a good chunk of my career working for political dissidents in other countries. So the idea that I was going to become a political prisoner in my own country, while not an attractive idea, not something I'm like, wow, this is exciting, it wasn't surprising.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's the thing. A lot of other people who got caught up in Russiagate got really angry and indignant and sort of shrieky about it. But I figured, as my book's titled, Dangerous Company, I dealt with dangerous people. They may not have been drug dealers and murderers per se, but there were some dangerous people involved in my career. And USAA, the term insurer of the United States military, my wife was covered by them because she had worked for the government.
Mm-hmm.
And she encouraged me, because of my work, to get a life insurance policy. So I applied for a term policy with USAA. And their response was, after months, I got a detailed letter rejecting me because of my work in Ukraine and because of putting myself in proximity to likely targets of assassination. I was an uninsurable person.
Of course you were. Of course you were.
They had written that.
Yeah.
The underwriters had actually studied the issue, and I was sort of impressed. I kept the letter.
Well, I
somewhere.
think it kind of gives you a badass tag, whether you want it or not.
Yeah, but I deserved some form of trouble.
I would think so.
Yeah,
sure.
It was a stupid law that I broke, and It was stupid to break it, and it was a fairly harsh prosecution of me versus how the rest of the world is dealt with. Got it. But, it's better than getting whacked.
It sure is. It's better than the alternative. Exactly.
You got to be philosophical about it.
When you got down to it and you were getting to sentencing, what was your attorney saying? Did he think that you were going to serve time? Was there an understanding that this wasn't going to be that? Or because I know leading up in some of these articles, you went through a variety of thoughts of, where am I going to go? I'll just go. I'd rather go to the DC jail and hang out there. And that's a weird time period for anybody who's been indicted and is pled. And you have to figure out from that point on, that weird limbo, what
Mm-hmm.
happens next. You go through your own prison before you go to prison, if you ever go to prison.
They should count that time.
They should count that time.
You're serving time while you're waiting to serve time.
I totally
agree. And I never
agree.
served time, so that sounds like a somewhat glib thing to say. But that period before I think, and others who have served have validated this, that period is worse.
It's
because you don't know.
It's a nightmare.
Uncertain.
Yeah.
And I figured maybe I do 30 days to 6 months.
Yep.
But I didn't, and I just wanted to make sure that, I was able to do that and come out okay on the other end.
Well, I think you obviously would have been able to do that because of all the different things that you'd done throughout your life. And that was, you prison is an odd thing, but one thing that's liberating about prison once you go through it is you think, well, I can do that, and for most people who have lived their life a certain way, they can do that. They will themselves to be a survivor through it, and they work their way through that. So you get sentenced, you find out you have probation, and how, as far as your mindset of where you are today, Sam, you've got a great book that's getting ready to come out. We're probably going to see a lot of you in all different places. Where are you at, Sam Patten, today?
Right now, Sam Patten lives in Bath, Maine, which is about halfway up the coast of Maine. We're actually on the Kennebec River, and it's a shipbuilding city that builds destroyers for the U.S. Navy, but has been building, been a major shipbuilding city in the country for 150, 200 years. I have a pretty simple life here, really. I work as a cook in a restaurant. I do some freelance writing. You mentioned my column.
It's a great column, by the way. Just check it out, the Memoir.
Well, thank you. I also occasionally work as a bus driver. Have you ever seen the show Newhart?
Yeah. Well, I've seen the previews of it. Yeah.
I do Airbnb, kind of like Newhart up here as well. So a number of different things while I'm sort of finding my footing and trying to figure out what it is I'm going to do, and what David Brooks calls the second mountain of life.
Yes. And do you see, because of where you're at and what your history has been through your life, that you would get back into the political world, that it's kind of in your DNA?
Well, if I can be helpful in different sides, understanding each other better and improving the state of play, sure, I'd like to do that. But I have to figure out the right way of doing it. I've been struggling with the American political system for years, since I first got involved. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing we talked about Cambridge Analytica. Mm-hmm. One of my hopes for working for a British political consulting company was to break into the U.S. system via Britain and reform our system. Mm-hmm. Why did Donald Trump win in 2016? Aside from, who he was running against, the other reason he won in 2016 was how broken our political consulting class is. Mm-hmm. And it's so broken that a foreign company, this Cambridge Analytica, was able to get some contracts. And I just thought that was great, because I believe in competition, and we have a very unimaginative, very negative, very cynical, and not particularly good for America consulting class. So if we could destroy that and build something better, I thought that was kind of cool. So yeah, if an opportunity like that comes again, it's going to have to require a lot of people being committed to doing things a different way than we've been doing.
Well, I mean, I think, the reason I ask you that is you bring a lot to the table, is experience of through the political world, through the criminal justice system, experiencing all those things, surviving, knowing the good and the bad and the ugly. I think you could be a lot of help to a lot of people, and hopefully bring them ideas and things that maybe they're not thinking of that you've experienced that could possibly help in the long run. I always ask people this on the show, and your life, Sam, is incredibly interesting in what you've done and how you've done it. What do you think is your biggest takeaway through all that you've experienced up to this point?
That one shouldn't be afraid to try.
I love that.
I think that's, we live with, and you mentioned this just a few minutes ago about prison, and that feeling that when you've been to prison, you don't have that fear anymore. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of, when people take things away from you, it's never good to have things taken away from you and to have loss. But on the other side, you gain something. You gain a certain liberty. You gain a sense of your own strength and knowing what it is you can do. So I didn't love initially working as a line cook in a brew pub, but I liked the fact that I can do it.
That you can do it. I love that. That's a great takeaway too.
being able to do, to say, oh, I shouldn't do that. And increasingly, we live in a world of artificial fears where society is projecting different things, and people are afraid to do things because they be perceived. Once we know what our moral compass is and what is right and wrong, that should be the end of the story in terms of being afraid to do things. And I think that, the less afraid people are of what social media is going to say or what have you, the better things are going to be done.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to take action. And that's such a powerful statement, because I think people get into paralysis in their own mind, and, nothing is perfection. You just have to take action, and you'll evolve from that and figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
So,
worked so far.
Yes. And so here's the deal. You've got your book that's coming out. I noticed on Amazon that you can pre-order that. And
yes.
the book is Dangerous Company, Misadventures of a Foreign Agent. So I'll have that in
the foreign agent is in quotation marks.
It is in quotation marks, by the way. I just saw that. But yeah, go check it out. I'll put it in the show notes. If anybody wants to get to Sam Patten, I know you have a website. And
I've got a website for the book, which is dangerouscompanybook.com.
Yes.
And I believe there's a contact feature on that.
There is. I checked that out. And if anybody wants another book, if you're just in the book reading mood, check out Nightmare Success. And that's in Barnes & Noble and Amazon. If you liked anything you got in here today, because there's lots of nuggets of wisdom from a man who's experienced it all, go to Spotify, go to Apple, leave a review. It puts the show on steroids with all that weird algorithm stuff. And as I used to say when I was writing my emails back and forth from Leavenworth, stay strong. I'll do the same. Sam Patten, thanks so much for being here today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Brent. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Nightmare Success in and out.